Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about suffrage and suffragette theatre, women's theatre writing as political activism, discussed by Kate Newey. So thank you very much, Kate, and over to you.
Oh, thanks, Jo, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here, and what a privilege it is to come back and talk about these women. I really appreciate that. I've learnt so much from my Sunday mornings spent in these Zoom webinars, so it's lovely to be able to talk to you about it. So this is work from about I suppose the first decade and a half of the 20th century, when the suffragette movement really ramped up. And I'm very interested in thinking about work in the theatre as political activism. And as I work through this, you'll see how this came to happen through the work of some quite extraordinary women. As we know, throughout the 19th century, we have these several calls for suffrage in Britain. And I think the first really big radical grassroots movement was probably the Chartist movement. And they had a charter of the 5 points, including a call for universal male suffrage. And that became a really radical mass movement with huge petitions and the huge sort of gatherings at which public order was considered to be at risk. Fizzled out in the 1850s. The next, but of course it was for male suffrage. The next big movement we get is John Stuart Mill, and he and his wife Harriet Taylor advocated throughout their writing career, their joint writing career, which I've talked here about in these seminars. And John Stuart Mill's first act as a member of Parliament was to present a private member's bill to extend the suffrage to women. Didn't work. This was the late 1860s. The really interesting thing about the work that actual women were doing in the second half of the 19th century was that the women's movement then took on a number of activist campaigns, including, and I've sort of summarized them here, marriage and property reform, access to education, access to the professions, access to public space. And this is where, for example, the current debates about public single-sex spaces just bring back memories of the 1860s and 70s, where, and indeed the 1970s, where the excuses for not employing women, for example, were, oh, we don't have enough lavatories. This is a debate that keeps circling around, sadly. The really big activism of probably the last third of the 19th century for women was the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. And I won't go into that too much, but I'd really highly recommend the person who taught me all about this, which is Professor Barbara Kane, and her 2 books, English Feminism and Victorian Feminists, which interestingly, what you gain from reading these is that the activism for the suffrage, for the vote, was part of the movement, but these other things about women's access to the public world were also really important. And the Contagious Diseases Act was particularly important because of the way that it framed any woman walking on her own, and particularly looking like a working woman, looking like, say, a mill worker or a factory worker, could be forcibly taken off the street and gynecologically examined under the assumption that she was a prostitute. The way that the government of the second half of the 19th century in Britain dealt with the rampaging of venereal disease through the military, through the armed forces, was to suspect working women of being prostitutes. And this really, I think, was a fascinating example of the way that the 19th century women's movement picked up issues around women and sex difference, but also class differences. And we'll see this in the work of the suffragettes in the theatre. So you all know this. but it's just the framing. The suffragette movement, known as the Militants, felt that all the work done by, for example, the Pethick Lawrences, the other kind of 19th century campaigners for the vote, the suffragists, had not worked, and it was time to get militant. And so what we see is the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by the Pankhurst family, who were first and foremost socialists and trade unionists. And I think in all the critique of the suffragettes that I hear, and I hear it from my students, I teach this material to university undergraduates, they all say, oh, well, this was a middle-class movement. And I go, no. It was at base a socialist movement. It came from Manchester, which was the industrial city of the 19th century. It was called the shock city of the age. And it came from women who had been involved in trades union and socialist movements. And we'll see this as we move through it. So here's one of my heroines, Annie Kenny, who is an Oldham factory worker. This picture comes from the Working Class Movement Library in Salford that has a huge collection of Northwestern suffragette documentation. I've included the link there, which I know on a Zoom is not very helpful, but if people want to email me afterwards, Google my name and the University of Exeter and you'll find me. I'm happy to send the PowerPoint on to people who would like to follow the links. I think this will go up on YouTube as well, so you'll be able to sort of follow the links from the YouTube talk as well. And there are some wonderful fictional accounts of the suffragette movement, novels, and we'll see how one of the playwrights I'm going to talk about, Elizabeth Robbins, actually turns her material into novels, as these were probably more widely able to be distributed and read than plays. But part of the work of the suffragettes in the theatre was to develop texts and a kind of play reading culture that enabled these texts to be widely spread out amongst the movement. One of the things that I really love about looking at the suffragettes and thinking about the situation we're in today, maybe not love, maybe reflect upon, is the way that the activism was spread very broadly at a grassroots level, and that whatever people did was seen as important, from the largest to the smallest actions. Simply attending a rally was significant, being part of the spectacle of women. And so the whole movement, I think, can be seen as this spectacular theatrical movement. And that was, I think, part of its strategy and strength. There's a lot of talk now about organizations such as Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. And I think the founder of Extinction Rebellion noted that some of their inspiration came from the work of the suffragettes more generally, and the kind of spectacular actions that the suffragettes created in creating a kind of activist politics. So here are links, for example, further information and links that I've used in creating this PowerPoint, actually, and that I use in my research, coming from the Museum of London. The Museum of London was at the Barbican. It's now moving to Smithfield, I think, but they still have they have a number of online exhibitions. So it's worth just Googling Museum of London and you'll see their online exhibitions. And they have a wonderful collection of activist suffragette ephemera, if you like, badges and banners and medals and so on. And some of those I've included as illustrations in the PowerPoint. So The specific involvement of theatre professionals in the suffrage campaign is a really interesting one. It was filtered through an organisation called the Actresses Franchise League. And the best reference source for that, I think, is Jules Holliger's book, published back in 1981, but it was actually her PhD from one of the colleges at the University of London, and I can't remember which. But she actually was doing this in the late 70s, as you can see from the date of publication, that Virago publication. She actually managed to interview some of the surviving performers and practitioners from the early 20th century. And if we see back here, Annie Kenney, for example, was alive, lived until 1953. So it was possible to sometimes capture the actual words of the women who are involved as performers and theatre professionals in the suffrage campaign. I'm going to say suffrage here because the Actresses Franchise League very early on made up their minds that they were neither suffragette nor suffragist. They were for the suffrage campaign for women, and they supported both sides. There was and sadly, I think we see these debates replicated. I remember when I was a baby teenage feminist going to women's lib conferences in Sydney in the late 1970s, early 1980s. One saw divisions and debates then. And I think in any grassroots movement that involves, 50% of the population, we're not all going to think the same way. And I think the Actresses Franchise League understood this, understood that the women involved in the suffrage fight, the fight for the vote, had a multitude of experiences and viewpoints, but were united in this one campaign, and that was fine. The position of women in the theatre is a really interesting one because throughout the 19th century, although being a performer and working in the theatre was considered to be a bit of a kind of déclassé. If you were middle class, you lost respectability, supposedly, by working in the theatre. It's not particularly true. You could be very respectable and work in the theatre, and many families, it was a family business, and they had to battle against this idea that female performers were akin to prostituted women. This was not the case, and it's those of us who work in the theatre of the 19th century as historians of that are constantly having to adjust the mythology that all actresses or chorus girls were actually also prostituted, kept women. This is not the case. The really interesting thing about women who worked in the theatre in the 19th and early 20th century is that it was the one area in the professions, and it was becoming a profession as opposed to just a way of making your living, if you want to make that class distinction. It was a profession in which women could enter and work on pretty much the same basis as men. They didn't get paid as much, but there was work there for them, and it was work that required talent, ability, networking, hard work, training, all those things that were used throughout the 19th century as an argument against women working. Women who worked in the theatre participated on the same terms as men. And in fact, various feminist theatre historians have been involved over the last 20 years in looking, and I've been one of them, have been looking at the way that women ran the theatre in the 19th century. We had female managers from the 1820s onwards. They ran theatres. They employed men and women. We had female playwrights. We had great star actresses, Ellen Terry, who worked alongside Henry Irving at the end of the 19th century. Interestingly, Henry Irving is knighted for his his activities towards the great national theatre. Ellen Terry, who was as much his partner in all of this, whether they had a relationship, you know, a domestic, intimate relationship, I'm not interested in, but she was his working partner in all of this, and didn't, it took till the 1920s, and Madge Kendall, who was given a dameship for her work in the theatre. She too was a female manager in the 19th century. So one of the things that was behind the formation of the Actresses Franchise League was that women working in the theatre were very aware of how much they worked as professional women alongside men, and very aware of how the injustice of not having the vote when they had, you know, they worked on terms of equality with their male colleagues. And it was often said towards the end of the 19th century that going into the theatre was a very good way for young women to make a living, and to make a good living, and to make a living that was satisfying artistically, as well as enabling them to support themselves. So the Actresses Franchise League had a playwriting branch run by the playwright and actor Inez Bensusan, who was came from Australia. She had been an actress in Sydney and then landed in London, and begins to work in the London theatre, which at this time, the London theatre was kind of the theatrical centre of the English-speaking world. And there are very interesting networks between London, Sydney and Melbourne, London, New York. These are international networks that mean that people working in the theatre were quite globally, well, certainly globally in the kind of white Western European idea of global, were quite globally mobile. And this holds true for the women working in the theatre as well as for the men. And at the beginning of next year, just to tell you something about what I'm doing in this field, I'll be starting a huge European funded project on looking at the networks of women working in the theatre in the long 19th century, so including this period, between Sydney, Melbourne, London, Dublin, Calcutta and Bombay, because there were women running theatres in Calcutta from the 1820s. White women, but they were women doing this really interesting work, and we need to know about them. Anyway, so Inez Bensusan ran a playwriting branch, and it operated as a kind of agency for circulating plays by women. Inez Bensusan wrote a play called The Apple, which you can find on, it's pretty easily available on various free internet platforms like Project Gutenberg or the Internet Archive. I think that's called archive.org, or Haffy Trust. These are places where texts that are out of copyright are digitized, and they're a wonderful free resource for doing this kind of research. Another play, we haven't seen revivals of The Apple, but I saw a revival of Geeta Sowerby's play Rutherford and Son at the Royal Exchange in Manchester, maybe about 12, 15 years ago. It's often in the repertoire. I think the National Theatre has done it as well. A wonderful play. Both of these plays are about male privilege and patriarchal kind of primogeniture, about the way that young women of talent and ability are caught in families where the kind of Victorian patriarchal father is handing everything over to the firstborn son, who is in the apple of his father's eye, but who is not particularly talented, not particularly able. And so opportunities are lost for the women, but also for the families. And what's really interesting in Rutherford and Son is Rutherford, the factory owner, he's a glass manufacturing factory owner, has 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. One of the daughters accepts her role as staying home and running the household. The mother has died. You know, these are families with dead mothers, which is a whole thing in itself we could talk about. But one of the daughters in Rutherford and Son expects and is expected to stay at home and look after the household. The other daughter is hugely talented and very entrepreneurial, and ends up, in a sense, marrying out of her class. Marrying instead of up, she marries down. Using the terminology of the time, I mean. She marries her father's foreman, her father's factory manager. And in doing so, her father sees her as stepping outside her proper class, but she sees it, the daughter sees it as an opportunity to work alongside her husband and to be married into a relationship where she is seen as an equal and as someone who can work alongside her husband. So I think that the relationship at this time in the early 20th century, the way that a lot of these activist women thought about the relationship between sex and class was really interesting, and actually perhaps challenges our view of sort of the early 20th century class, you know, our notions of the class and the class thinking of these women who were activists for women's rights. Again, as I said, you know, one of the things that's often thrown against the suffragette movement is that it was a movement for upper class property owning women. And I think that when you start to dig into the work, the writing of these women, both fictional writing such as plays, but also their non-fictional, their political and philosophical writing, you see that they saw the connections between sex and class really clearly. And, you know, have a lot to sort of teach us. So another of the movements at this time was a group called the Pioneer Players, run by Edie Craig, the daughter of Ellen Terry, and her partner, Christopher St. John, who was born Christabel Marshall, but took on this kind of male role, or non-gender conforming, I suppose, gender non-conforming role. And they set up a private members club which performed plays by women, including work by Siisy Hamilton and the American writer Susan Glaspell. And Catherine Cocken, who's written a lot about this work and has done a lot of work on the actor Ellen Terry and her daughter Edie Craig at their house in Small Hythe. It's a National Trust site now, and you can go along and they've done a lot of work on kind of recovering the feminist and indeed lesbian history, although I think they call it queer history, I'm sorry, of Edie Craig and Kit St. John, and the group that conglomerated around Small Hythe, which had a barn where they would perform. And Catherine Cocken, who's worked on this, argues that women's suffrage theatre was really, as you see, at the centre of this developing art theatre. This is the fringe, this is the kind of new theatre of the period. And it's often in private members clubs, because theatre at this point in Britain is still heavily censored. For example, George Bernard Shaw's play, Mrs Warren's Profession, which is a really robust play arguing the case for and against prostituted women and factory work. And he puts a very robust argument about the equivalence of those, the sort of prostitution of women balanced against underpaying them in factory work. And this is something that Siisy Hamilton picks up in Diana of Dobson's, for example. If you don't pay women enough in proper respectable work, respectable in inverted commas there, then are you surprised that they turn to allowing, prostitution and the selling of the prostitution of their bodies. So George Bernard Shaw's play, for example, was not permitted to be performed, even though the word prostitute is not mentioned. So there's very heavy censorship at this period. And a lot of the things that women want to talk about, write about, were things that the Examiner of Plays at the time would not have permitted to be performed on the public stage. So they formed these private members club, the Pioneer Players. The other famous one at the time was the Independent Theatre, which is where a lot of Henrik Ibsen's first plays, which are seen as suffrage plays, that he's not really, he said himself, he wasn't really a feminist or an ally. He just thought these were interesting problems at the time. But it's a real meeting point for these women wanting to explore the position of women at this time. So we also see in the popular theatre, so this is not the coterie art theatre, this is Kitty Marion, originally German, Catherine Maria, who was a music hall performer. And my colleague and friend Viv Gardner has put together her autobiography. I'm thinking sometimes Manchester University Press does an open access. They make certain texts free for access. So keep an eye out for that. You might be able to download Viv's edition of Kitty Marion's autobiography. But free access is to Kitty Marion's scrapbook, her feminist suffragette scrapbook. And this picture of her is from the Museum of London materials. Where this is from 1913, when she's on the street campaigning for birth control, which again was not the vote, but it was one of the campaigns of this period and one of the kind of radical activist campaigns. And there's an example of her scrapbook that's held in the Museum of London, and you can, they're online, you can go to the website and scroll through, and you can make it bigger so you can read it. So I think what's really interesting about this movement also is the way that many of the women were writing. And so many of our past sort of feminist mothers are lost to us because they were busy doing the work and didn't write it down. But we have the things like these scrapbooks to remind us of the work that they did. So they have some virtual exhibitions. So those links are there to look at, and they have some wonderful material. This is Siisy Hamilton. Again, you can see her kind of non-conforming gender presentation. She founded the Women Writers Suffrage League. There was also the Women Artists Suffrage League. So all of these organizations where women are already working. And I think this connection between women's work and suffrage is a really important one as well. Although there's some material I'm going to come on and show you where the connection, you know, for women who didn't necessarily work for money is also made. Siisy Hamilton collaborated with Edie Craig on the Pageant of Great Women, which involved Edie Craig's mother, Ellen Terry. And so it was this pageant in 1911 of the great sort of feminist heroines, including Joan of Arc and Ellen Terry as herself. Siisy Hamilton also wrote these plays, Marriage is a Trade, Diana of Dobson's, which is a play which addresses the issue of women working as shop assistants and the fact that they're not paid enough, that it's an environment that is founded on sexual harassment. Here's a picture from the performance of Diana Dobson's at the Kingsway. So it's a theatre that no longer exists, but I think always, every time I'm walking up the Kingsway in London, you know, from Southampton Row and up into Bloomsbury, that kind of area of London is very much for me connected with this time. the kind of fringe theatres that existed around Bloomsbury, the way that Bloomsbury was a place of both living and intellectual work at this time. And this is before, or perhaps in spite of, the Bloomsbury movement, but certainly Virginia Woolf is then in the middle of this. So Diana Dobson's touches on the whole argument about the prostitution of women. If you're not paying them enough to live on in these so-called respectable jobs, then why are you so why is there this hypocrisy about them moving into prostitution, for example? So I want to talk about the plays now for the rest of the time. And I'm going to, there were lots of plays, but I'm going to sort of, for simplification and just for the purposes of introducing you to the material today, I'm going to talk about two categories. And the first is the category of what in theatre we call Aget Prop plays. And then the second are the main stage dramas. And I'm going to look at an example of each, because there's not much more time, but I hope that you'll seek out or be aware of when these other plays come into performance. And I can talk about, there are still revivals. The Finborough Theatre has a very good programme of reviving women's work. And I just saw earlier this summer a revival that they did of two plays by women from this period. Not overtly suffrage plays, but again, one of them touches on the way that when women are not paid enough, that they're forced into forms of prostitution to support their families. So the Finborough, and 15 years ago, the Orange Tree Theatre in Richmond did a very concerted effort over 2 years of recovering lost plays by women that still work commercially. And what's really interesting is these plays still work. They still get audiences and they still intrigue audiences. And it's kind of a challenge to the main stage theatres like the National Theatre, the Scottish National Theatre, Leeds Playhouse, all the big subsidised producing theatres, that they need to be recovering these plays. They still work and audiences love them. So Aget Prop. Aget Prop is short for agitational propaganda. And in theatre history, this was attributed to a kind of street theatre during the Russian Revolution. And there was a particular company called the Blue Blouses. I forget what the word is in Russian, but anyway. And they raced around. I always have this image of them racing around the streets and doing short, very simplified, quite dramatically crude plays that were dramatizing the political issues to bring people to specific political causes. And so this kind of street theatre, you'll often still see it at big political rallies. I'm not sure if there was anything going on yesterday in London. I mean, well, there was a lot going on yesterday in London. I don't want to think about what was going on, but street theatre and Aget Prop has long been a kind of tool in the activist toolbox. So, for example, a colleague of mine wrote her PhD on a company called Janam, which is a street theatre group in Delhi, and I've seen their work, and it actually is tremendously theatrically sophisticated, and it gets you emotionally as well as politically involved. So that's the way that theatre works, and it's the way that propaganda works. Now, my argument, people attribute Aget Prop to its beginnings in the Russian Revolution, but my argument is that it actually starts with the women's suffrage movement at least a decade before, in the first decade of the 20th century, with the feminist suffrage theatre. And it comes through the Actresses Franchise League. And one of the things they did was to supply short, easy to perform plays, such as one of my favorites, A Chat with Mrs Chicky, by the playwright Evelyn Glover, who was a Lancashire woman. And she wrote Chat with Mrs Chicky. She wrote another play called Mrs Appleyard's Awakening. And they're all plays that have a pop at the antis, as they were known, the anti-suffragists. And again, it's refracted through the lens of class. And so the setup is, it's a middle-class sitting room, and Mrs Chicky is the cleaner, and Mrs Holbrook is the sister of the man of the house, and is trying to tell Mrs Chicky about how terrible these women are who want the vote. Now, the really wonderful theatrical joke about this play, and I've had my students work on it in the studio, is the whole time that Mrs Holbrook is trying to educate, and we know that phrase, educate yourself, coming from those people who think they know about our arguments, you know, our current feminist debates. Mrs Holbrook is trying to educate Mrs Chicky. Mrs Chicky is trying to clean the sitting room. And so Mrs Holbrook is sort of standing there or sitting there, and Mrs Chicky is working the whole time. She's scattering the rug with tea leaves and then dusting it. She's moving furniture so she can mop underneath it. She's physically working the whole time. And it's a wonderful theatrical kind of use of theatricality, of the embodied kind of demonstrating Mrs Chicky's work, the work of a working class woman, to enable Mrs Holbrook, the middle class woman, to tell her that she's wrong, or to educate her about, you know, not needing the vote. So I've got some really banks of text, and time is running out because I want to play you some actual radio proper performance stuff from another play. But this is a good example. Now, my good woman, just tell me your difficulties and let me explain them. And Mrs Chicky said, and I think this is some sort of version of a Cockney accent, which I will not try to do because it would be offensive. My original accent is northeastern, moderated by being in Australia for a long time. But what Mrs Chicky says here is difficulties. Well, I guess many married women finds it a bit difficult not being her own child's parent. Going by the law, that is. It's a bit difficult for her, as the law don't give her no voice in a child's schooling or religion or vaccination or such like in the ordinary way. It's a bit difficult for her, as her husband can pretty nice starve her, and if it's eased the mind, she's got to go to the length of leaving him before she can get a maintenance order, and often it's none too easy to get that carried out. So Mrs Holbrook has no idea of the legal difficulties that a woman like Mrs Chicky faces if she marries the wrong man, you know. And for a lot of women at this time, marriage was kind of essential, but also the most important economic decision they made. And then Mrs Holbrook interrupts Mrs Chicky and says, but where have you read all this? I'm sure it's nonsense. And Mrs Chicky says, bless your heart, you know, madam, women like us don't have to read about the law like you ladies. We're too busy knocking up against it, as you might say. I don't suppose any of your lady friends comes before the magistrate more than once in a lifetime, but it's different with mine, though I've kept clear so far myself, thanks be. So the realities of working class life, and the close and difficult relationship with the law, which is obviously passed by middle class and upper and aristocratic men in the parliament, are all too real for Mrs Chicky. Here's a long speech that I'll read a little bit of. The interesting thing is that all the way through this speech, Mrs Chicky is sweeping the floor according to earlier stage directions. And what we have is Mrs. Chicky, while she is doing this physical labor, cleaning Mrs. Holbrook's house, Mrs. Chicky is now telling Mrs. Holbrook about the realities of women, working class women's lives. I'm going to play a little bit of another version of this. But Mrs. Chicky says, the first time I heard a lady at a street corner saying as women ought to have votes, I listens for a bit and I says, I'm on this job, I says, she knows. She's talking gospel. She ain't sat in no drawing room and read about us. She knows. She didn't waste no time telling women out working to keep body and soul together as they ought to be queens of their homes. She didn't go talking about a man's home for all the world as if he ought to knock at the door and ask his wife's leave every time he wanted to get inside it. She didn't waste no time telling women who'd sent their lads off to fight with their own hearts breaking for all their lips were smiling, as women hadn't no feelings for their country and didn't understand nothing about war, and so on. And what Mrs. Chicky is doing here is throwing back all the anti-arguments from men and women about women not having a stake in the country because they didn't own property, women not having a stake in the country because they didn't fight in the wars. And she's saying women are all of these things. We raise the children, we look after the houses for the men, you know. It's quite an extraordinary speech. Now, this is a simple two-hander that was written to be performed, and in fact the author's note at the beginning of the script says, you know, if you do it with a set, all you need is a table and a couple of chairs and a broom or a rug, but you could also do it without any set at all. And I imagine, and in fact we know, that these plays were sent out all over Britain to be performed at suffrage meetings, partly to, you know, explain to women why they needed to be part of the cause, but also I think for solidarity. You can imagine a meeting of women in the East End of London, or in the suburbs of Manchester, in Oldham or in Bury, or in Sunderland. This speech of Mrs. Chicky bringing women to their feet and cheering and making them kind of feel in their hearts as well as their minds about the day-to-day realities of what life is like without the vote, and the kinds of things that are going to be closer and more possible for them with the vote. And this is using theatre to help us to understand this. So the second kind of play I want to talk about are these main stage, big sort of more conventional 3-act, 5-act dramas, the kind of thing that Siisy Hamilton is writing. And I want to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Robbins, and then I'm going to switch over to clips from a Radio 3 dramatisation of her play Votes for Women, which she turns into a novel called The Convert. And the picture here on the screen is Elizabeth Robbins playing Hedda Gabler. She was an American actress working in London, became known as an actress in Ibsen plays, and became known for this highly powerful but highly emotional form of performing. And this is Hedda Gabler tearing up Lovborg's manuscript of his great work. We don't know what he's working on in Hedda Gabler. She's also a collaborator with a really favourite woman playwright of mine, Florence Bell. Now, what's really interesting about this, and I think says something about female friendship, is Florence Bell was actually Lady Bell, married to a mine owner, Robert Bell, in the Northeast. They were based in Redcar, and was anti-suffrage. And she and Elizabeth Robbins actually spoke quite frankly, and there are letters. There's letters in an archival collection in New York, where you can read the exchange between them. They maintain their friendship despite this huge political difference. And Florence Bell always argued that women could get their rights in different ways. And I think it's interesting the way that current feminist sort of writing about, particularly Elizabeth Robbins, tends to gloss over Florence Bell and say, oh, she couldn't possibly have known. But she writes one of the first pieces of kind of sociological ethnography, I think, called At the Mill, because she, as a great lady, as it were, actually went into the homes of the women who ran the households in the villages which supplied the labor for her husband's factories and mines. And she saw firsthand what happened if women had husbands who spent all their money gambling or drinking. And she wrote a play, it's a terrible play, but she wrote a play called The Way the Money Goes, which shows the problems for women where their husbands spend the money and don't leave anything for the family, and the bind that these women are in economically because their husbands are irresponsible and don't think about the family first in the way that the women had to. You know, so I always see those two as a really inspiring collaboration that, in spite of deep class and political differences, they worked together to make art. And Alan's Wife is an extraordinary play about infanticide, which again is available fairly widely electronically. I really recommend reading it. So now to finish, now this is where the technology gets a bit tricky. So we cross fingers that it works. Radio 3 did a dramatisation back in about 2016 of Votes for Women, and it's a really interesting play. It has 3 acts, and I'm going to pull out, we've probably got time for at least the first 2 clips I've got. The first and third acts of this play feel like a drawing room drama that Oscar Wilde might have written. It's all politics and marriage and so on, and the plot revolves around a liberal politician played by Samuel West in this case, so we will hear his voice occasionally, who is marrying a very young woman. He's had a relationship with Vida Levering, which a relationship outside marriage, which resulted in a pregnancy. Vida terminated that pregnancy, and the woman that Geoffrey Stoner, the liberal politician, is now going to marry, finds out about this and is inspired by Vida Levering to join the women's movement. That's the first and the third act. The middle act, Act 2, is a rally at Trafalgar Square, which was staged. And Elizabeth Robbins writes this, and I have a feeling she was at these rallies. So hopefully we will have time to listen to at least the working woman's speech, and she's not really given a name in the script, nor is the working man given a name in the script, but they're really interesting speeches that to me give us a flavour of the kind of spectacular activism that was part of the real world, you know. So what is happening on stage is happening off stage in the real world. So I'm going to just try to pull up my right, and hopefully Joe will coming through. Great, lovely.
It's a libel to say it's only the well-off women what's wanting the vote. What about the 96,000 textile workers? What about the Yorkshire tailoresses? We see there's reforms needed. We ought to have the vote. And we know how to appreciate the other women who go to prison for trying to get it for us.
You evidently don't know what had to be done by men before the extension of the suffrage in '67.
You say a woman's place is home? Don't you know there's a third of the women of this country got to go out to help pay the rent and keep the home from being sold up? And some women that haven't got any homes at all.
You said you got one, why don't you stop in it?
Oh, yes, sir, that's like a man.
You go home and nurse a baby!
Yeah, I do nurse my baby. I've nursed 7. What have you done for yours?
Oh, I say!
But We don't only want better things for our own children, we want better things for all. Every child is our child.
What about the men? Are they all happy?
There's lots of you men I'm sorry for. We'll help you if you'll let us.
You women are blacklegging the men.
Now, why would any woman take less wages than a man for the same work? Do you really think we've got a liking for low wages? No. And when we get our rights, a woman's flesh and blood won't be so much cheaper than a man's that employers can get rich on keeping you out of work and sweating us. We've got the same clause.
True as
We
gospel.
ought to have the vote.
Miss Ernestine Blunt will now address you.
So that's the first clip, and then let me go to the next one. Again, I'm hoping this, oops. No, that's not going to work. Wait a minute. Sorry about this. I'm just, right. Sorry for the slight delay. It's asking me to log in, and I thought I had already. It's moments like these. Right, I'm going to just have to log into all of this. I thought I had this set up. I'm really sorry, people. Right, let me try it this way. No. Sorry for the
So, Kate, I think maybe because we've only got 8 minutes left, maybe
right,
we could just miss out listening to this, and
Yeah.
because you talking is so brilliant.
no.
That would be we'd be very happy, and we could listen to this. We could get the link later and
Yes.
listen to
Yeah.
it.
I mean, I think that the reason that it's shall I stop sharing completely?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think the reason that it's password protected on what's called a database called Box of Broadcasts, which if anyone's working in an educational institution, you will have access to. It's just asking me to log in and so on, and it's a very boring process. But I think that gives you a flavor. This is written by Elizabeth Robbins. It's performed at the time. Gives you a flavor, I think, of the kind of discourse that she, as a ostensibly middle-class professional, is attuned to. And the second clip I wanted to play was a working man, and I put it in there because there's a bit of a joke in it that the working man speaks to the women and says, I don't know about these liberals. They might say they're going to do more for you. And remember, this is before the Labour Party is a big force in British politics. These liberals might say they're going to do a lot for you, but I'd keep an eye on them if I were you, women. The Conservatives might not do as much for you, but they'll do what they say. And I had to laugh about that in current British politics, where, and I think it's the similar situation in the United States, where we often find ourselves in certain of the current feminist campaigns. We find ourselves reluctantly and sometimes incorrectly linked with what are often seen as more conservative views, and the dilemma for British women in voting for a British Labour Party that still isn't prepared to say what a woman is clearly and distinctly. So it was sort of a private joke for me and chuckling about that. So I'm just quickly looking at some of the notes in the chat, and I'm interested that some people say that still when they were taught about the suffragettes in the 1970s, they were taught that it was a mostly middle class movement, and I think this is a kind of pervading myth. I think it's changing. I hope it's changing. because I think it's always been used as a way of somehow, slightly dismissing the suffragette movement, and also dismissing, well, the vote isn't everything. And I think what's really interesting is that one of the things I would say is, yeah, I think the women of the time knew that the vote wasn't everything. And the fact that a lot of the theatre of this time takes on all these other campaigns, the campaigns for equal pay are there, and we hear that with the chat with Mrs Chicky. We hear that in the little clip the one clip I've managed to indicate for I've been able to share with you. Just to find my final share of the screen, and I will go to it because I want to give a shout out to her work, is the wonderful Rebecca Morden. Now, some of you, I don't know if she's listening today, but she certainly got the invitation and emailed me about this. She runs, some of you will know her from her fantastic Mistress of Ceremonies at Filia. But the other thing she does is run a feminist production company called Scary Little Girls. And shout out to Rebecca if she's in this morning. She's running the Maven Festival down in Cornwall at the moment. And she does, during lockdown, she did a wonderful thing called the Salon de la Vie. And there were a couple of episodes on the Actresses Franchise League. And she does one, I think it's in the first series, where she does about 6.5 minutes into you can find them, they're open access on YouTube, where she reads another Actresses Franchise League text. It's written by a man, I'm sorry, but it's a really funny play, one monologue called The Anti-Suffragist, which is getting into the head of an anti and making her very, very silly. And Rebecca does a gorgeous performance of it, as well as playing on the ukulele and singing some feminist suffragette songs. So I really recommend that. If you want more of the kind of performative, Scary Little Girls, fantastic organisation, and I'll be working with them on my project. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I'll stop talking there. We've got about, I know, Joe, we have to finish. We've got about 2 minutes, but thank you so much for the opportunity. It's a real honour and a privilege to speak to you all about this. It excites me, and I love teaching this material with my students, who all look at me and go, wow. So it's lovely to share it with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was really interesting. There's loads of comments in the chat. I'll send that to you so you can read it at your leisure later. And we look forward to having you again soon.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, bye everybody, and see you next week,
Bye.
hopefully, or maybe in the breakout rooms.